Thank you again, everyone who is coming to this Majlis. We have 17 people now in the room, and the most important of all of us is Letizia, who is the guest or the owner of this Majlis. As you know, we have both freshly found gems in this Majlis and scholars who are well established. Letizia is certainly a very well-established scholar and researcher who produces wonderful work on Abbasid culture. There are many things which I can share with her in interest, including that both history and culture in general are her fields, and literature, and she also published on bureaucrats, and just recently she published with Mike van Berkel together a wonderful book, a festschrift for Hugh Kennedy, whom I also hope we will have. Sorry, I'm just admitting people in another Majlis soon. And now we are going to talk about, or she's going to talk about her recent book, her research on this extremely colorful collector who can help us to, who will be our keyhole today for the whole Abbasid civilization, I assume. Like, I'm muting myself, and Letizia, can you please start?
Hi, hello everybody, and thank you very much for allowing me to present my book in this Majlis. I had the opportunity to be in the audience for some of the Majalis last year, and it was a great experience. And I'm particularly glad about this format, and I was particularly glad to hear that we could also speak about the process of writing the book, because I think I am a living cautionary tale. I think I have, in writing this book, I have committed all possible mistakes. Everything that I warn my students against, I've done it. And the first thing that I'm going to do is something I warn my students against. Never apologize in advance. So I'm just going to apologize now. First, because I've got a cold, so it might be that I have to interrupt myself quickly and get a glass of water or something. And the other thing is that it's actually the first time I'm talking about this book in front of an audience, so it may become unclear. Please give me feedback about what I say. So now, Istvan, would it be possible for you to tell me when 20 minutes have gone, because I can see where I am. What I would like to
shall I tell you at 5:30?
Yes, that would be great. That would be great. Because the first part, as suggested by Istvan, the first part of this talk will be about this book, how I got the idea, what I thought of, and what I did and what I didn't do. And the second part, I will just be describing the contents without going too much into detail. And then, if anybody is interested in asking specific questions, of course, I'm here. So I have to start. The reason why I said I am a living cautionary tale is because I started thinking about some of the things that are in this book a very, very long time ago, when I was still doing my PhD. However, I think it is actually a very good story. So I will start from this. I was doing, when I was working on my PhD, I worked on biographical literature, or biographical dictionaries, as I described them at the time. I don't do that anymore, and I will tell you why. So at that point, one of the biographies of that I studied more in detail, I studied the biography of this man, Abu Bakr al-Suli, in different collections. And one story about him that caught my eye was a story found in his biography in Ibn Khallikan, Wafayat al-Ayan, collection of obituaries of prominent men written in the 13th century. So this Abu Bakr al-Suli was a man of many abilities, and one of his abilities was that he was a chess player. He was a famous chess player, and Ibn Khallikan tells us this story towards the end of his biography. He says that he was so famous that people thought that it was al-Suli who was the inventor of chess. He was such a famous chess player. But this is wrong. It was the Indian Sissa ibn Dahir who invented chess for a king called Shahram, spelled with a shin and an e. The king said to Sissa, "Request what you wish." And Sissa answered, "I request that you put a grain of wheat on the first square and then continue doubling its number up to the last square. Whatever amount it reaches, you give it to me." Now, I think everybody can see where this is going, right? There is going to be too much wheat. It's too much. The quantity is too much. And I'm reasonably sure that a few in this audience have heard of this story already. I don't know if you have, Istvan, but certainly a few people will have heard of this story. A few people will have heard of it. They will probably not remember where they heard it from. When I read this, I actually did remember where I'd read it the first time, and this is where. So this is when I was a child. I was an avid reader of Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck comics. And this is a story where, what's his name in English? I'm sorry, I don't know the English names of this. Also, this is Donald Duck's lucky cousin, Gladstone Gander, who, because he's lucky, he discovers this magical checkers board that he puts a grain of rice on it. They're hungry, so he puts a grain of rice on it, and it starts doubling and doubling and doubling, and you can see that it becomes doubling on the squares, and then keeps counting and counting and counting, and then it becomes too much, and then the story is that the whole house explodes because there's too much rice. So when I read this story, I immediately remembered this thing, and then I went to my mom's house and I found this comic, and yes, it was right. This was the story. So my first question was, how did a story in a 13th century Arabic source end up in Donald Duck in the 70s? And I set out to investigate how this happened. And actually, I did write an article on it that finds how this story, the story of the invention of chess, gets into Europe. And it's a very interesting story, and Oxford has to do with it. Edward Pocock, the first professor of Arabic in Oxford, has something to do with it. But if you want to hear about it, I will tell you about it. It's a very nice story. But this was this is what made me interested in al-Suli more than I already was, because there was this story on chess that piqued my interest. But he was a very interesting person anyway, a very interesting character anyway, because he has a complicated reputation. There are lots of contradictions in his life. He writes, and there are excellent works on many subjects. On poetry, he's an editor of poetry, he's an expert of poetry. He has 2 books on chess. The Fihrist at least lists 2 books on chess. He writes on chancery. His Adab al-Kuttab is one of the main books of the earliest books on chancery we have. And of course, he has chronicles, history. And what is special about al-Suli is that he writes about his own time. He writes the chronicles of the caliphates, of caliphs, where he served at court. So he served at the court of the caliphs al-Muqtadir, al-Radi, al-Mu'tadid, al-Muqtafi, and he writes the chronicles of these caliphates. So he has a very specific and important insider's perspective from inside the court that all sources, modern and contemporary to him, value enormously. He is valued, however, as an eyewitness, not necessarily as an interpreter of events. He's said to be short-sighted, interested in gossip, too interested in his own success at court, very vain, too literary, too interested in poetry, in his own poetry, unable to see beyond, unable to see the significance of events. And this is something that both his younger contemporaries, but much more our contemporaries, 20th century historians say. He's not taken into account. Another interesting thing that really pushed me to read more and more of al-Suli is that chess is, the further away we get from his life in time, the more important chess becomes. We have seen in the biography of Ibn Khallikan, biography of al-Suli written by Ibn Khallikan, most of al-Suli's biography is occupied by chess. Earlier biographies have much less chess. They have it as in the title of al-Suli's books, but they don't talk about it in the biography. Al-Suli himself never talks about chess in his books. He has, apart from the technical book on chess, he does not mention, he mentions countless interactions with other poets, with caliphs, with the viziers. He mentions a lot of occasions where he actually composes and recites poetry in front of caliphs, viziers, etc. He never says that he played chess with them, although this was obviously one of his activities at court, according to his biographers. The only place where I have where I've seen that he mentions chess, of course I may have missed it, but the only place is in I think it's in the أخبار الشعراء المحدثين, the Chronicle of the Modern Poets, where he says that he knew somebody because they lived next to a place where he would go to meet the other chess players, the other shitranjiyun. This is the only thing that he mentions, just in passing, but there is no chess. So this was another thing that that interested me. So I began to study al-Suli's work, and especially his historical work, and especially the parts that concern his own time. What I found is, besides the fact that there was no mention of chess, I found there was a lot of poetry, much of it al-Suli's own poetry. And this is also quite unusual. And also it's interesting because there is no collected diwan for al-Suli's poetry. So he is himself an editor. He collects himself diwans of other poets, but he does not, there is no collected diwan for al-Suli himself. While I was doing all this work, I realized, and this is the more autobiographical part, that the very features that scholars, also modern scholars, despise in al-Suli or do not value in al-Suli, make actually his work unique because it offers material for both historical and literary investigation. And in a way, I became defensive about these accusations. One of the most important, I would say one of the most formative events in my academic life was the first meeting of the School of Abbasid Studies I went to in 2002 in Cambridge. I was just out of my PhD, literally, this was my first grown-up conference. And my discussant was Joseph Van Ness. So you can imagine how nervous I was. And I was talking about the Vizier al-Qasim and Mu'abbad Allah, and how he was always, this Vizier would always be portrayed as a bad person, as a bad influence and dishonest man, etc. And one of my sources was al-Suli. And Van Ness said, well, you know, yeah, this is all very nice and interesting, but it's like tabloid gossip, tabloid newspaper. What's the historical significance of all of this? And I think this was really made me see, made me become quite defensive about gossip, about how gossip is important for power and for shaping the memory of events. As you can see today, to this day. And also, it made me see how really I could use this aspect of al-Suli's style to investigate a lot of issues. So I wrote several articles, but it was clear that a book was what I needed, and also what al-Suli needed. Here was another problem. Life and time. So I had this person, this scholar, who had an interest in life, who had a large body of work, extant work, not very well preserved, not very well studied, not all very well studied, let's say. I had a lot of ideas, but I knew that Life and Times books, Life and Works books are not very fashionable. Can we say that? Are not very well received, and are also very difficult to do well. So I wrote a series of articles, but I didn't know what to do. A lot of people told me, you know, I should write a book on al-Suli, you have so much material. But I really wasn't sure. It seemed so daunting, and I wasn't sure how to tackle it. I knew there had to be a specific perspective in order for it to work. And in the end, it was this defensiveness that suggested to me what I should do, which was to tackle the issues that have been the object of debate in our field, and use material on al-Suli and by al-Suli to discuss them. And especially, I used the parts of al-Suli's work that intersect with his life. So I decided to concentrate on the parts of al-Suli's work that intersect with his life, because his life and his work are equally interesting to me, and to see how I can use this material to contribute to some issues that have been debated in the past decades in the field of Arabic studies. Another thing that, again, is I realized I tackled reactively, that as a reaction is that I refuse to treat historiography and literature as two different fields. I have tried, I have failed. I have always failed. I tried to write about literature, and suddenly I'm talking about society and history of emotions and money and social groups. And I tried to write about history, and suddenly I'm talking about poetry and how the author uses dialogue to express a certain specific style. I cannot do it. And so I think this book is really a result of this. What am I doing for time? Ah, perfect. So this is the end of my 20 minutes, right? This is exactly the place where I wanted to be. So actually, the title, History and Memory, is not a title that I chose. This was the publisher made me do it. Literature should have been in there. So sorry. I realized that I didn't put the book title in the presentation. So this is it. Is it flipped? History and Memory in the Abbasid Caliphate. Writing the past in medieval Arabic literature. However, the subtitles are mine. Now the subtitles are my own, of my own making. So now I'm going to talk about the contents of this book. It's not a very long book, and it's structured around 5 issues. The first issue, Life and Afterlife, is how al-Suli is portrayed in biographical sources, and especially how each author, each biographer chooses from a common pool of material to produce a sometimes very different portrait of this man. So in a way, I say life and afterlife because the afterlife is the evolution of al-Suli's reputation in time. In doing this, I discuss what biographical dictionary means or doesn't mean. And I suggest a way of looking at biography, a classical Arabic biography and biographical collection that is a bit more forgiving than a strict distinction between literary genres and attempts to identify biographical dictionaries as a specific genre. The second chapter, in his own words, is on autobiography. And especially I look at how al-Suli uses, inserts episodes from his own life in the chronicle of the Abbasid Caliphate. So the chronicles of the years when he was at court or afterwards are still extant, most of it. And at certain strategic points, he inserts episodes from his own life, not only from his own interactions with important people, but also what happened to him personally. This is a way for me to discuss autobiography. This has been also an issue that's been discussed by, most importantly, the RAL group, and I always remember if it's Portraying the Self or Writing the Self. It's two books that are, but anyway, the book edited by Dwight Reynolds and by Hilary Kilpatrick. And I discuss how what I call the fragmented autobiography of al-Suli, what effect it has on his history writing. The third chapter, In His Own Time, looks at al-Suli's network and discusses about his contemporaries, his education, his relationships with colleagues, pupils, employers, within and outside the Caliphal court. And in doing this, I discuss new and old way of looking at, we used to talk about milieu, think about Pella's work on al-Jahiz milieu. Today we talk more about networks, and there has been some work on social network analysis. We also talk about material culture, of the importance of books, and on the importance of, I have used what I consider very important concepts of proximity and resemblance, coined by Shaukat Turawa in this part. Chapter 4 is about al-Suli's written production, and this is something that tackles what I think is something very relevant to our understanding of Abbasid historiography. One of the reasons why al-Suli's historiographical work is not used very widely, although parts of it are have been available even in translation for a long time, is that there is really a lot of poetry. What I try to do in this chapter is to link this pervasiveness of poetry with the rationale of al-Suli's complete work. And I try to show how poetry is not only just an addition and embellishment, but is the spinal cord of al-Suli's work. And it's also a way to cross-reference events, not only in his more in his specific work on poetry or in his akhbar of poets, but also in his akhbar of caliphs. And this dovetails into a discussion of how we need to rethink our ideas of casual ideas on encyclopedism. We talk about an encyclopedic nature of 10th century scholarship, and this is misleading. The final chapter, chapter 5, tackles the question of what it means to have historical sense, what it means to be a historian. If you can be an interpreter of events, as a poet, as somebody who's vain and a gossip, can you still see clearly events, and can you still be a historian? In the chapter, I explore the different ways in which al-Suli intervenes in the narrative flow of his akhbar by inserting himself in the events he relates, not only as an eyewitness, but also as a co-protagonist who is able to influence the very course of events by interacting with the other protagonists. But it also looks at the evaluation he gives of the events he describes, and how he identifies and organizes causal links between them. So this is the general structure of the book. Now I will give you the way I want to, how am I doing for time? Now I want to give you a little bit for each of the chapters, and then leave some time for questions. So in Life and Afterlife, my point about biographical dictionaries is that, as has already been pointed out a very long time ago by Wadad al-Qadi, who's one of the historians who has studied biographical literature most, is that there is no classical Arabic expression for biographical dictionary. She gives herself her own definition, which is completely acceptable. Other scholars like Gillot give slightly different definitions. In the end, it's a very fine line to decide what is a biographical dictionary and what isn't. And one of the main reasons for this is that since the early 20th century, even the late 19th century, scholars have been fighting about whether writing biographies is something that originates in the pre-Islamic Arabic interest for genealogy, or in Islamic interest in hadith. Depending on which one of these school of thoughts you support, you will select a different sample of works to be what you define as biographical dictionaries. What I propose is that we do away with this word completely, and we concentrate on the fact that biographies are collections of akhbar, ordered in a specific way. You can arrange biographies according to different criteria, to different in different alphabet order, but what is important is the microstructure of a biography, and this is surprisingly constant across the centuries, up to Kahala, one of the recent biographical dictionaries. This is the structure that I suggest in my book is constant for most biographies, starting from the 8th century and arriving to Haji Khalifa, for example. So in my, when I look at al-Suli's biographies, I start from this pattern and I look at what is included, what is left out. And I examine this structure as a frame which can be filled with predictable slots containing different types of information, which in turn may be equipped with fillings such as narratives, poetry, or both. And what I find about al-Suli, as I said before, is that al-Suli starts off as a scholar, as an adib, and ends up in the 16th century as a chess player with no content other than his life as a chess player. In the chapter on autobiography, I just copied here for you something that al-Suli himself says in the Awraq. This is something that happens to him when after he leaves the court of the last caliph he serves. The last caliph he serves, al-Radi, dies, and the next caliph, al-Muttaqi, doesn't want any courtiers, and he probably doesn't have the money to pay them, although it's never mentioned. So al-Suli goes through a series of misfortunes, one of which, well, he says that he becomes broke. We never know if it's really true. But one of the things that happened to him, his house is robbed. There is a burgled. There is a burglary in his house, and he loses most of his possessions. And what he says here is important from the autobiographical point of view, because it shows, it says, I have now said, after he, complains about being poor and I don't know what to do, and people were unfair to me, and I worked so much, nobody's grateful, etc. And then he says, I have now said what I had to say of my personal situation, relating true facts and how they evolved to those with discernment, hoping to find some comfort and relief in complaining to people. Now, God willing, I shall return to illustrating events. So, okay, he's petty, I agree. But look at the distinction he makes between Dhikri Hali, sorry, a dot is missing here. So my personal situation, and Sharh al-Hawadith wa ma jara, and events, what happens, the illustration of events. So this sentence for me demonstrates that he is very aware of the difference between the historiographical side of his work and the more autobiographical side of his work. Now, of course, what do we mean when we say autobiography? In my book, I also discuss the problems related to an idea of autobiography for the Oriental man. I mean, for a long time in the West, it was thought that the Oriental man doesn't have any individuality and therefore cannot really provide an autobiography. This is obviously quite racist, amongst other things, but I find it particularly not true for al-Suli. What I propose is to apply to al-Suli the concept that Hilary Kilpatrick came up with, that of fragmented autobiography. So coming through the Awraq, there is a way to reconstruct an arc to al-Suli's story. What the the idea that this man wants to give of himself to posterity. It may be short-sighted, but it is an arc. It is a story seen from a specific point of view of his own life. So it amounts to an autobiography, for me, at least. Now, about the, in the chapter on network, on his environment, I talk a lot of al-Suli's notebooks. I talk about his education and his how we can, from his lists of teachers and students, cross-checked with akhbar in his own work and in biographical collections, how we can reconstruct overlapping networks of scholars who move in different environments and have different interests. And I also talk about a couple of episodes where this seemingly very silly stories about squabbles between courtiers, for example, that al-Suli tells in his own work, serve as points of reference between different chapters of his book. Another thing that I concentrate on, as I said, is this sentence and its implications. Again, talking about the burglary. The burglary comes up a couple of times in al-Suli's chronicles, because obviously it's been a traumatic experience for him. Here he says that he has been poor since then. I have no income, no connection with anybody who could give me gifts or advantages. So he has no employers, he has no patrons, he's not at court anymore, he's in Basra teaching. I live on the prices of my notebooks and the proceedings from the sale of a garden, which was my life and heaven. So the second part is quite clear. He had to sell land in order to have enough to live on in the last few years of his life. But I live on the prices of my notebooks. What does it mean exactly? Athmar dafatiri. In the chapter, I cross-check this story with other stories and with references from other authors to try to reconstruct how al-Suli and his network used books and notebooks. No, let me see. I will tell you more about this later if you're interested. What I think it shows, this is the moment where there are it's conflicting ideas, of course, about writing and written transmission and oral transmission, but they're not necessarily contradictory. Final chapter. Sorry, not final chapter. Fourth chapter about organization. As I said, in this chapter, I go through al-Suli's, Ibn al-Nadim's Kitab al-Fihrist, the catalog, has a very detailed list of al-Suli's works. Not all of them are excellent, but quite a few of them are excellent. The magnum opus by al-Suli is the Kitab al-Awraq. Now, we know the Kitab al-Awraq, mostly we think about it as a chronicle of the caliphs, but actually Ibn al-Nadim gives us a very long list of parts of the Awraq. A lot of it is poetry. And actually, the full title Ibn Nadim gives of this book is Kitab al-Awraq fi Ash'ar al-Khulafa wa akhbarihim. So Ash'ar, poetry, is in first place, and akhbar is second place. In this chapter, I try to demonstrate that this is not by chance. That poetry is the spinal cord around which al-Suli organizes his material across the whole of the Iraq, even the parts that are thought of more as political history. The other thing that I look at is, well, this story that I think summarizes al-Suli scholarship quite well. This is a story he tells. It's in a biography of Abu al-Aina, the scholar of the previous generation. One day, I went to see Abu al-Aina. He had lost his sight at the end of his life, but he could hear my pen scratching on my notebook. "Who's there?" he asked. "It is your servant and son of your servant, Muhammad ibn Yahya al-Suli. My boy, rather, or son of my brother. What are you writing?" "Some grammar and inflection," he said. "Grammar in speech is like salt in food. When there's too much, it's disgusting. My boy, if you want to be a star at scholarly gatherings, you must learn law and Quranic lexicography. But if you wish to be the companion of caliphs, men of value and belles lettres, you'll have to take a pinch of poetry and spice up akhbar." And this to me is really the rationale of al-Suli's work. Poetry as a spice and as a guiding principle. In this chapter, I also talk about, as I said, in general, the organization of knowledge in the 10th century. This is something I've written with extensively together. I've worked on extensively together with James Weaver. And this chapter draws from that work. It is too lazy for us to talk about encyclopedic mentality in the 10th century. We can, however, talk about a moment when there are increasingly larger books. There are increasing amounts of paper at writers' disposals. There are larger and larger archives. So we have to think of organization of not only knowledge, but also organization of information and organization of material, of tools in a holistic way. And usually this is another field where, you know, we have philosophers on one side, and then we have all the rest of us on another side, and it's worth organizing, looking at it holistically. And the last chapter. So here I'm giving you not a quote from al-Suli, but a quote from Dominique Sordel. Whoever has studied the 3rd and 4th century Hijri in Iraq will know Dominique Sordel's book on the Abbasid Vizierate, on Abbasid Viziers. It's still, to this day, it is a reference. You cannot do without it if you work on this period. Of course, Dominique Sordel, as every good French scholar, has a whole first chapter where he discusses all his sources. He's not very happy about al-Suli. Says that he has no historical sense, and that, you know, he's not a very good observer. This is not only Sauder's opinion. Marius Canard, who translated a lot of the Iraq, has a similar opinion. Other contemporary historians have the same opinion. Al-Suli describes events, but he doesn't see what they mean. In this chapter, I try to show, I look at a couple of, I look at a very interesting decade, actually, something I want to work more in the future. A very interesting decade between the appointment of the first Amir al-Umara in 934 and the appointment of the takeover of power on the part of the Bouyid family in 945. These 10 years are particularly chaotic in Iraqi politics. Nobody knows who's in charge. Lots of generals go up and down the Tigris, retaking cities, populations, laying waste to fields. It is a very difficult time, and Suli lives through it. Another chronicle for this time, who's reputed to be a much better historian, much more, capable of interpreting events, is Miskawayh, who writes a century later, or even more than a century later. I don't know. So I look at the same events, and I contrast these two historians, and I show how they portray it. And I try to show, I think I succeed, that al-Suli's vision is different, but it's not more naive. Miskawayh's vision makes more sense to us because it's packaged better, but it's not necessarily more accurate or more penetrating, a more penetrating interpretation of events. So I think this is all I wanted to say about the content of the book. I think it's about 6, so it's fun. Is this?
Yes, this is. Can you hear me? Yeah, this is wonderful timing of a wonderful talk.